Good evening. Ibrahim carried him down 3 flights of stairs from our home the last time he was with us in body. In his arms, Gilberto was but a pale, twiggy version of himself, without the strength even to hold on. Beautiful, healthy, peripatetic Ibrahim, a dark brown Senegalese Muslim man who was morbidly afraid of illness, offered to carry him. Ibrahim's heart had filled with compassion and a sense of freedom by what he had seen of Hil's dignity and faith. And Ibrahim said, "He's not heavy." Gilberto had arrived 2 weeks before, at the end of our process of moving from the first floor to the 3rd floor in the seminary building that used to be on 58th Street. I can see it from here. After living 2 years with us in Bakersfield, California, he announced that he would move to Chicago with us in 1991. Now, it was 1994, and he stood at the door with 1 suitcase and the guitar, a dying man. I couldn't believe how he looked. He told us he was sick in phone calls before he arrived, but I never dreamed. This was the Gilberto who, after years living with internalized homophobia and self-denial, as well as deep disillusionment with religion and the church, had been found by the gospel in a little farming town called Lamont, California. Another Gilberto was working as assistant pastor at the time in the 2 churches I was serving in the area. He was doing what we came to call friendship evangelism among Mexican farm and restaurant workers. When they got off work, he would just hang out wherever they were, talk, play win their basketball games, and invite them to the Sunday night service at the Methodist Church on Main Street. His first convert friend was Gilberto Castañeda. They were tocayos. Having the same first name was a special bond. Gilberto Castañeda admired Gilberto Amaro very much. He was especially fascinated by Gilberto's guitar and the songs we sang so joyfully and so often. He wanted to learn to play and sing, and he did, eventually sharing music with people in Bakersfield, Lamont, Carruthers in California, in Chicago at John Huss United Methodist Church, at CTS, and at Crossroads, a house for international students that used to be across the Midway on Blackstone, just a block or 2 away. When he got to Atlanta in 1994, he made his contribution in the MCC Church and St. Mark's UMC. The only thing was, every song had the same rhythm for Gilberto. His strumming was like the heartbeat of the song. Thrum, 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 thrum. And we just sang around his thrumming. Gilberto was quite clear that this love of God for us, just as we are, was a very new thing in his universe. He'd grown up in the Catholic Church in Mexico and had attended several semesters in college, but religion hadn't been faith, and knowledge wanted experience. On the back of a photo of himself, after he had been found by the Good News, he wrote in 1991, "Guilty of wanting everything to be fantastic and full of color in this my new life, but most of all knowing that the connection between love, friendship, and brotherhood will always exist in the world and in my life. With affection, Gil." As he lived in close association with us from 1988 to 1991, we began to discover his special gifts, and he began to see them too. He was a consummate host. He loved thinking about parties and arranging the table. He was so at ease with people. He'd open conversation with almost anybody, anywhere. He liked to look well put together, nice clothes, just a few, different looks. He was enchanted by any photo op and was always photogenic. He loved beautiful colors. and the most terrifying rides at Six Flags. I always dress up for this evening because he would have liked it. He brought the Advent custom of the nacimiento alive in our home, making lakes and waterfalls and paper mache mountains for the tabletop nativity scene that glowed with tiny lights and was inhabited by figurines of people and animals from all over the world. He loved and was totally at ease with children. He worked as an undocumented in the U.S. in the informal economy as a dish and bottle washer, chef's assistant, and house painter. He was the only human being who imagined and played new games with our gentleman dog, Chulo. He really got down on the floor or the ground and played with him. There's a great picture of that on this board somewhere. Oh, yes, right there. When Gil left in late 1992 to return to his hometown, Aguascalientes, in northern Mexico, in order to help his mother move and to try to finish college, Chulo experienced one of the great losses of his life. When he left us, Gilberto had accepted God's love for him and was beginning to understand that God loved him not only as an ardent young Christian, but also as a gay man. He even felt a call to return to study at CTS one day. After returning to Mexico in '91, he began to explore sexual relationships. Unfortunately, in one of the early ones, he was infected with HIV, which he didn't know for sure until a few weeks before he arrived. A lifetime habit of denial and emotional, toxic relationship with a man in Atlanta resulted in deferred diagnosis and treatment. And so he stood on our doorstep saying, "I've come home." Despite the best efforts of the wonderful medical team at Howard Brown Clinic and the Northwestern Medical Center, Gilberto died of massive complications due to AIDS 2 weeks later at the age of 29 in the summer of 1994. While he was with us that last time, he shared a lot with Ted, who was his nurse and confidant. Gil sang the songs he learned during his new life, as long as he had the strength. And when he couldn't, then he asked us to sing them for him. His most prized possession, the beautiful guitar that Dow Edgerton and Ray Sparrow had given him, he never put down until the end. It's back now in Dow's possession and is heard now and then, I think, in this chapel. The love songs are not silenced. Gilberto was one of the people it might be easy to overlook and discount. Though he began to see that he could be the very man God had created him to be, he's not the sort of someone for whom scholarships are named. And so it seemed to us amazing and simply wonderful when Susan Thistlethwaite and other faculty announced the creation of the CTS Gilberto Castañeda Scholarship to support future gay and lesbian seminarians. In honoring the memory of one of the least, CTS honors our common Lord. Gil is among the great cloud of witnesses that surround us tonight. And as we say in Latin America, though he has died, yet he is presente. As I call his name, will you respond with presente? Gilberto Castañeda. Presente. May the one who brought Gilberto safely home guide us all toward the light divine and the dawn of the earthly reign of justice, generosity, and joy. Blessed be.
Good evening. Every year, CTS chooses one or more students as Castañeda Scholars. The Castañeda Award goes to students who, in our estimation, embody in exceptional ways the vision and mission of our program in LGBTQ religious studies. Several of the previous recipients of the Castañeda Award are with us tonight, and I'd like to ask them to stand and be recognized. This year, we're giving the Gilberto Castañeda Award to two students in two different degree programs. The first honoree is a PhD student who came to us after earning a BA at Bluffton University and an MDiv at Princeton Theological Seminary. Since entering our program, he not only has made good progress toward his degree, a dean's concern, but also has been exceptionally active in both academic and denominational conferences on a range of topics, including LGBTQ issues. Jason Fry, would you please come forward? I'm happy to recognize Jason as one of our Gilberto Castañeda Scholars for 2016-2017. Our second honoree is an MDiv student who came to us after earning a BA from Rice University and a master's degree from University of Alabama at Birmingham. In addition to working as an occupational therapist and traveling extensively, she's been an activist in both church circles and her wider community, including around issues of LGBTQ United Methodist inclusion and anti-racism in the South. She's also the first Castañeda scholar who has studied with us fully online. For that reason, she's not with us face-to-face, but she is joining us via live stream. So I'm happy to recognize Jennifer Sanders as our second Castañeda Scholar for 2016.
Will you pray with me? Creator God, creating still. On the sixth day, you declared all that you created very good. You sustain us with breath of love and word of grace. You love all that you have made, chickadee and ant, antelope and armadillo, cedar and cactus, oak and maple and pine. The mighty oceans and their creatures, whale and plankton, we offer you our thanks and praise. Creator God, creating still, you make all things richly diverse and varied. Flying things and creeping things, running things and swimming things. A tapestry of many threads, many colors. Humanity, too, reflects your divine multiplicity. Your image refracted and mirrored in black and brown and yellow and red and white. In English, Spanish, Korean, Arabic, Igbo, and Inuit. In gay and lesbian and bi and asexual and queer and straight. In male and female and non-binary and transgender, we offer you our thanks and praise. Creator God, creating still, move among us this night. Remove fear and suspicion, increase faith, make of this sanctuary a house of prayer for all peoples, seminarians and trustees, faculty, staff and visitors, eunuchs and aliens and strangers, friends of Gilberto Castañeda, both long time and new. Open our ears to listen, our minds to learn, our hearts to love. Lead us on to that great day when all shall find a place of welcome at your banquet table. And may all who will say amen.
It is my privilege and pleasure to introduce tonight our guest lecturer. Reverend Dr. Pamela Lightsey is a scholar, a social justice activist, really activist, a military veteran whose academic and research interests include classical and contemporary just war theory, womanist theology, queer theory and theology, and African American religious history and theologies. Dr. Lightsey is currently the only out African American queer lesbian ordained as an elder in full connection in the United Methodist Church. No small feat. Dr. Lightsey has served as associate pastor of a church in South Georgia, as senior pastor of an urban church on the south side of Chicago. Yes, she is home tonight. And has done work for several United Methodist general agencies and has strong connections with several mainline denominations. As an activist, Dr. Lightsey has worked within the LGBTQ community to end Don't Ask, Don't Tell, the military policy, and to ensure marriage equality. She continues to boldly critique churches for homophobic polity, liturgy, and homiletics. She was on the ground protesting against excessive police force during the first 21 days of unrest in Ferguson, standing alongside our trustee, Pastor Tracy Blackman, and others, and was one of several live streamers providing ongoing broadcasts across a one-year period. Dr. Lightsey has consistently collaborated with activist colleagues in the movement for the liberation of Black lives, those addressing violence against Black trans women, and institutional racism on college campuses. Dr. Lightsey serves as Associate Dean and Clinical Assistant Professor at Boston University School of Theology. She's a board member of Reconciling Ministries Network and coordinating team member of Church Within a Church. She also serves as the co-chair of the American Academy of Religion's Womanist Approaches to Religion and Society group, helping this steering committee develop annual sessions dedicated to privileging the theological and ethical scholarship and experiences of Black women in America. She's among one of the first members of the executive committee for the Soul Repair Project, which studies the role of moral injury in veterans. She has several publications, including her new book, Our Lives Matter, a womanist queer theology, which you can order from a variety of places. Also, Reconciliation in the volume Radical Evangelical, and If There Should Come a Word in the volume Black United Methodists Preach. And on a personal note, she is one of my inspirations for fierceness. Welcome, Dr.
If I can help somebody as I travel alone, if I can cheer somebody with a word or song, if I can show somebody they are traveling on, then my living shall not if I can help somebody as I travel along, if I can cheer somebody with a word or a song, if I can help and show somebody they are traveling off, then my living shall not be in vain. My living shall not be in vain. Oh, my living shall not be in vain. If I can help somebody as I travel along, then my living, then my living, then my living shall not be in
That was glorious. It really was glorious. And I thank you all for the gracious hospitality. To President Hunt, to the members of the Board of Trustees, to Gilberto. You know, we call that name. We call his name to remind us that his living was not in vain. Thank you for that review, that wonderful review of a life well lived. It touched me deeply because I've lost my brother to AIDS. And I don't know that one fully ever recovers from walking through that crisis in life and from missing someone who you love so dearly. And at the same time, recognizing that that pandemic is still going on and that so much more can be done. But the politics of it all just simply muddies it up and doesn't allow us, prohibits us from doing what's right too often, and that's why we need the memory of Gilberto to stir us to say and do the right thing. So I'm eternally grateful to be able to stand here in honor of his great work and to celebrate what you all are doing here at CTS. So I want to begin by simply saying that the title sort of was a first thought. You know, y'all call us months in advance asking for titles. And by the time you get down to it and the program is printed, you're like, damn. Okay, so that's the first expletive. Just so y'all know what I'm about. Okay. A few months ago, I ran into this compelling fragment of a poem by Lorraine Hansberry, the author of the award-winning play based on her novel, A Raisin in the Sun. The poem is written under her pseudonym, LHN, the abbreviations, LHN, to the Ladder. The Ladder was the first lesbian magazine published in our nation. Hansberry died when she was only 34, and you know she was a Chicago woman. When she is remembered, she's spoken of as an author, as a civil rights activist, and as a gay rights activist, but never as a non-gender conforming activist, despite her own writings to the Ladder using words such as my homosexuality. Because the arts have always been central to the liberation struggle led by Black people, I think that it's appropriate that I begin with a reading of this fragment, which was written in 1962. Hear it. I regret that love really is as elusive as everybody over 30 knows it to be. My consuming loneliness, all the frigging hurts in this world, that a certain lady let my letter be read, the shallowness of the people who have come into and lately been expelled from my life. I like 69. When it really works. I'm just reading. Y'all already going in, and I'm just reading. She wrote, I like the first scotch, the fact that I almost never want the third or even a second when I am alone. Praise fate. The inside of a lovely woman's mouth. The way little J.W. looks in the movies, her coquettishness, her behind, those fresh little muscles, parts of the lingering memory of a betrayer. I am proud that I am losing some of those fears that I struggle to work hard against, many, many things. And on my own, of my people, I should like to be utterly, utterly in love, to work and finish something. End quote. Hansberry's poem about her regrets and likings seems to me to be a really appropriate way to begin this conversation about Black Lives Matter and LGBTQ rights. I chose Hansberry's poem because in my own way, as I lecture and as I write, I am concerned to give honor to the many Black lives that have made a way for young activists to disrupt, to break into the expected everyday American way of being. As a Black lesbian, queer lesbian, I think it's important, and if you read my book, you'll understand why I self-identify as queer lesbian. Shameless plug there. As a queer lesbian, I think it's important to continue to dispel two notions. One, that Black LGBTQ people are a rarity, and two, that the Black Lives Matter movement is not significant for LGBTQ persons. The several contexts within which I work have taught me that erasure happens too easily and quite predictably when we pursue only our own deliverance. This is why those who declare queer space, who critique categories and speak of fluidity rather than giving into the limitations of boundaries cannot authentically do the work of activism without taking to heart an intersectional analytical approach. That is to say that there are no clear boundaries when it comes to bigotry. The oppression of Black bodies and LGBT bodies often intersect. And if they come for me, they will come for you. There is no safety in identity. This is why it is important to hear Black people in the ways they continue to point us to the materiality of the subject Black body over and against how it has been constructed in the imagination of white supremacists. In bodily disruptions, Black activists have offered their human, not photoshopped bodies in ways that help those who believe in freedom now to recognize the constraints, biological, police, theological, class, and so forth, that hinder us all. While not for public consumption, Hansberry's erotic and same-sex loving declarations in her poem cast visions of the human body in action and is a literal protest against the well-behaved model of bourgeoisie respectable Black bodies. The sexy 69 or 69 position when it works. A woman's mouth or her behind. Hansberry's poem is not only risque for her time, but the poem has stood the test of time in its ability to remind us of the body in relation to other bodies. We understand the body of another because it is constructed much like our bodies, with mouth, with behind, with muscles, with sexual organs. And that sometimes, no matter our strong passion and imagination, we, LGBTQ, straight, male, female, gender non-conforming, just can't make this body do what we thought it should do. The other body beckons us to consider it in relationship to our own bodies and to the history that other bodies, has created. This is the relational aspect that Judith Butler wrote about in her book, Precarious Life. And here's a quote. The body, she wrote, implies mortality, vulnerability, agency. The skin and the flesh expose us to the gaze of others. Excuse me. But also to touch and to violence. And bodies put us at risk of becoming the agency and instrument to all of these. Much better. Although we struggle for rights over our own bodies, the very bodies for which we struggle, are not quite even our own bodies. The body has its invariably public dimension, constituted as a social phenomenon in the public sphere. My body, excuse me, is and is not my body. Indeed, if I deny that prior to formation of my will, my body related me to others whom I did not choose to have in proximity to myself, if I build the notion of autonomy on the basis of the denial of this sphere of a primary and unwilled proximity with others, then am I denying the social conditions of my embodiment in the name of autonomy? It is oppressive conditions, I believe, or as Foucault would say, power relations in which black bodies have toiled, in which oppressors have sought to shape the will of the black persona, and in which justice-minded persons continue to detest and demand change. Because our bodies, all of them, are constituted in relationship with others throughout time, it is important that we learn from our past relational errors rather than succumb to being no more than traducers of history, rewriting the truths which do not fit our privileged status and sense of individualism. The most recent examples that come to mind are McGraw-Hill publishers describing slaves as workers in a caption in their world geography textbook, and the repeated myth that Latino immigrants have taken over the job market and are raping American women. The struggle is real, even though the history is constantly in jeopardy of being misrepresented. For people of color, for LGBTQ persons of color, it does not serve us well to believe we can hand our well-being over to private negotiations, to controlled discussions, to playing nice at a table where having a seat is more important than the content of the meal being served. As Hansberry wrote, the acceptance of our present condition is the only form of extremism which discredits us before our children. Hansberry's determination, the ongoing movement to ensure equity, safety, and respect for black people is about the concrete day-to-day existence of bodies, bones, organs, skin, hair, nappy hair, and how the body, our bodies, clothed in dark skin matters. As part of my experiences on the ground in Ferguson and Baltimore, and my recent travels to Palestine and Cuba, I've been pondering, really, deeply thinking about black bodies. Not about how black people behave or think about how the very presence of black bodies changes the atmosphere of a room, a neighborhood, a town. I'm really concerned about the materiality of black bodies. A few weeks ago, I was on my way to a conference here at CTS, and I began to read an an article written for Sojourners magazine by a writer by the name of Bob Schneck about Christians and gun ownership. Listen to this first paragraph in the article that he wrote. Sitting at a dining room table full of fellow evangelical pastors, he wrote, I asked how many were carrying, which is a euphemism for being armed with a concealed handgun. They all raised their hands. Then I asked, what determines when you draw your gun and prepare to shoot another human being? There was awkward body language and mumbling. After a few seconds, one older man said, I'll tell you what determines whether I draw the gun or not. It's the man's skin color. I was left speechless by the pastor's jarring, blatant racism, he writes. Still, as respectfully as possible, I asked him to please clarify what he meant. Well, we got a big city nearby, and you know, the black people there are always killing people. Now, if a colored man comes into this county, I know he means trouble because he knows he doesn't belong here. That makes him more dangerous than a white man. That's why I pull my gun, end quote. Notwithstanding the fact that this article reveals the depth and virulence of racism, but more relevant for our reflection is the idea that merely the presence of a black man is understood as evil and therefore, without interrogation, warranting guns being drawn on him. While much of our outcry has been about excessive police force against unarmed black persons and the expected outrage as we have had to witness numerous filmed accounts of their murders, I am desirous and therefore pushing tonight for more reflection on the established boundaries, real and perceived, that dictate where our bodies belong and why other bodies can, as Lansbury once stated, freely come cruising through the very communities they despise. The aim is a discourse on the stigmatization, the villainizing, and regulating of human bodies in particular spaces. Let me shift now to some questions about sacred spaces. Perhaps the more precise undertaking is to question normative spatiality in light of heterosexual hegemony. To wit, I'm arguing for the need to question the authenticity of spaces that presume and demand the complete barring of all but the dominant group. But that's a dangerous question, precisely because it prompts us to address not only the limitations on spaces for black bodies, but the shutting off, the politicizing and checkpointing of spaces against blacks, women, disabled, and LGBTQ persons. For instance, it is to wonder how we have constructed such sacred spaces as the pulpit and the bathroom. To question the pulpit as phallic ideation and public bathrooms as sites for biological sex validation. To critique the sacredness of the pulpit is not without cause, since, as you know, we still hear phrases like, we let women preach here all the time. Or I just can't get used to no woman being up there. While the speaker is declaring that the presence of the female body behind the pulpit, the symbol of power, is an anomaly, the imagery here is that of the body in its function as a vessel conduit, drawing its power, its influence from that sacred, albeit constructed site where being biological male is a necessary, if not sufficient, condition for charisma. Yeah. Moreover, the most reverent element of these divine sites of power is essentially that these divine spots need protection in and of themselves. The bathroom needs protection in a way that an empty theater does not. It needs its own special status. It needs its own special status in a way that it did not in June 2007, when Senator Larry Craig was tapping his foot as a sign to say he was in the bathroom as a man in waiting or wanting, you decide. To question these socially constituted sacred sites where marginalized bodies may not enter or may enter only under additional systems of oppression is a necessary work for LGBTQ communities and its allies. This is work, and this work is bigger than a hamburger, as civil rights activist Ella Baker once said. Disruption is now expanded beyond lunch counters, beyond bridges and schools, from the church to the bathroom, from the streets to the White House, from America to the global world. What the Black Lives Matter movement is teaching us is what can be gained by disrupting our perceptions about what is and is not off limits for protest. However, disruption as an element of protest is not without its weaknesses. Excuse me, and this is what I want to spend some of my remaining time sort of massaging through. The oft-used chant, if we don't get it, shut it down. And with some other flavorable words used here and there. If we don't get it, shut it down. That's been on my mind a lot. Indeed, I participated in shutdowns and will in the near future participate in a few more disruptions where we literally use our bodies to break into an environment to call attention to an injustice taking place. Schools have been shut down, highways have been shut down, conferences have been shut down, and so forth. A disruption at one of Bernie Sanders' first weeks on the campaign trail caused him to reassess and restructure his political campaign. While some may say that disruptions at GOP rallies have had little impact, I disagree. I think every presidential candidate, as a result of disruptions, has had to consider what they will say to Black and LGBTQ voters, because a large number of voters are allies to persons of color and the LGBTQ community. So they have to think that thing through now. Disruptions are political tools. Yet disruptions have been, regrettably, political tools that end up betraying the very democracy to which its leaders aspire, and I'll explain that. Conferences have been disrupted in this leader-full movement by Black and LGBTQ persons in such a way that they end up doing more harm than good for our communities. And that's just the truth. I was at a conference a few months ago, and this conference was shut down because a Black woman and her peers decided that they had a right to seats in the main area rather than in the overflow area. And these persons walked into the main area, looked at white allies who had been in the struggle, and told the white allies that they needed to give up their seats to them under the rationale that they needed to give up their seats because giving up their seats was giving up their white privilege. And then they called out the black male presider for using patriarchal power in order to, what she thought was, quiet her. Other similar moments have happened at other conferences, one here in Chicago, an LGBTQ conference. Attendees at this conference, which I attended, sat in stunned disbelief as these white allies, people who followed the conference rules and registered in advance for the seats that they were in, began standing up to give up their seat. Lovely white folk. And I was sitting there thinking, older white people who you know have been in the struggle since before King was a thought, were giving up their seats because this sister demanded that they give up their white privilege. Baby. You know, and I was, I'm going to go into this a little bit more. But this was not unique to that conference, okay? And this is the kind of situations that white allies are asking about. Where do I fit in? You know, this kind of questions that are going on. Thankfully, one young black woman stood up from her seat and told the allies, no, you all stay right in your seats. Then she, with the security guards, let the disruptors know that they were out of order. I would have told them that they let the cheese slip off their cracker. I simply don't have patience. I don't suffer fools gladly. I'm sorry. I just don't. I don't care. I just live too long to suffer that kind of stuff. Let me get back to here. I am thoroughly convinced that protest movements may be leader-full, but they cannot be community-less. To do the work, we must subject our bodies to being accountable to the communities that we are working with and for. Otherwise, we belie our stated purpose and reveal ourselves as part of the neoliberal agenda that is framed by its sensibilities to individualism and privilege. This was the case with California's Proposition 8. Now, I'm about to meddle, and I'm just going to tell you, some of you all about to be uncomfortable, but it's the truth. The God knows it's the truth. This was the case with California's Proposition 8, the 2008 bill against same-sex marriage. What made Proposition 8 such an egregious moment in LGBTQ activism is because the work did not involve the total LGBT community. Okay. The advertisements largely featured white LGBTQ persons in wedding garb and all booed up with little inclusion of black LGBTQ persons. Yet when the proposition passed, many white persons within the LGBTQ community vilified the very persons whom they had erased in the political strategizing. Now, while I wish I could say that this has changed, far too much of LGBTQ activism resides in marketing, branding, communication, strategizing, and leadership of white gay men. I found it beyond contemptible that while I have worked with a very prominent LGBTQ nonprofit agency advocating for social justice within the United Methodist Church. When RMN, which is Reconciling Ministries Network, supported financially and programmatically the work that I felt called to do in Ferguson, I felt a deep sense of pain reading the comments. God, you can't read the comments anymore. My God, you trolls, you nasty trolls. I felt a deep sense of pain reading the comments coming from white LGBTQ Christians who saw no reason for our men to add their voice and power and the power of the agency to the campaign for Black lives. Now, as long as Reverend Dr. Lightsey was calling the church out on homophobia, that was a welcomed word. We love you. We love you. We love you, girl. But when I stepped off the plane in St. Louis and placed my body among other Black bodies marching up and down West Florissant, then the comments to the videos being posted by our men described me as an outside agitator. I was reminded by white people that, quote, it's not the color of our skin, but what's in our hearts. The truth of the matter is, the underlying problem is that I crossed a boundary. The fear of inclusive spaces, the anger against bodies that cross status quo spaces, is the fear of the loss of fixed boundaries that legitimize the existence of privileged minorities. So here I was in my gender nonconforming self, having restrictions placed on when and where I should enter into my work as an activist. And that I didn't take too kindly to. But this is what I'm massaging here. This is what I'm working with. The limitations placed on our bodies, where we enter and how we enter, and what spaces that are contested against our bodies as Black people, as LGBTQ persons. And lastly, and perhaps all too briefly, I want to push us to think about the future of our disruptions in terms of the body as imago Dei, in terms of the body as made in the image of God. That is really important to me, that we think about not just disruptions, but disruptions which the body is involved with as a sacred vessel, as one made in the image of God. It was the human body as imago Dei that participated in the primordial disruption of chaos as part of God's created work. Therefore, I'm thinking of this through, ought we not consider our current disruptive work as not against an ordered life, not against the peace of the city, not against the Pax Republic, not against the city's peace, the well-being of the city, but actually, should we not consider disruption as necessary to the preservation of life and the onward journey towards our eschatological goal? So what I'm saying is disruption is important for our hope as human beings. If that is the case, and I believe that it is, then the goal of disruption is never assimilation. We are not disrupting in order to become like the status quo. It is not for the purpose of joining the status quo, but to always agitate the status quo from every location our bodies journey. It is to shake it up by asking questions, to call BS when you see BS, and to sashay yourself into whichever and whenceever bathroom helps you maintain the dignity of your being. my fear is that after the disruption, or what we think is the succession, the end of the disruption, that we will become comfortable in what we think we have gained. And that LGBTQ brothers and sisters and friends, black folk, that will be the ultimate deception. That we allow ourselves to become comfortable and actually to become part of the status quo. And this is the predicament that we are fighting against as activists, that we should always fight against. The work of the activist is not to gain acceptance with the status quo. And do not be deceived that when our bodies enter and how our bodies enter, the ways that we enter are being watched. Oppressors watch this. I'm ending. I'm trying to end here. I'm trying. But I've learned. I grew up in the civil rights movement. I'm saying this to the church. I'm saying this to LGBTQ communities. When you think you have gained something, actually, the oppressors have been watching you, and they have learned your methodology, and they got you. And what you think you have gained, you have not gained. Hello, look at the voting rights. Look at gerrymandering. Look at gentrification. All of these things are important. And so, if marriage equality was the highest goal for the LGBTQ community, well, bless you and your spouse. It is not the only thing which we need as LGBTQ persons. In fact, if that is the highest goal, then count me out of that. As a member of the United Methodist Church, I'm going to shut shit down. But the goal is not simply so that the church will remove the discriminatory language out of the book of discipline. Just because they move some words out of a book does not mean the end of oppression. Just because America writes some bills does not mean the end of oppression. Just because they allow women to be ordained does not mean the end of oppression. My God, there's still churches where I cannot go and stand in the pulpit. Not just because I'm black, but because I got tits and ass. The oppression does not stop. And so this disruption, disruption to which I'm speaking about, as I'm trying to convey here tonight, where our bodies enter, this is an ongoing work. This is an ongoing work that never ends. We shape it, we reshape it, we look for how oppressors regroup and come into oppression in other ways. We cannot be settled with any accomplishments, because those accomplishments will be attacked in another decade, maybe even in another year. So this is the work that we must continue to do. And disruption, is more than simply shutting stuff down. It's shutting things down as activists and remaining diligent to the cause of justice. Thank you.
For thinking with us and before us, for massaging ideas, for inviting us to disruption and to think critically about disruption. Can we thank our speaker one more time? We have time for a few questions. There's a mic in the back if you would go there and speak so that not only we can hear us, but those on live stream can also hear us. Of course you may.
It's in me. I just need a moment to be grand. Yes.
Here's my situation and question. I was invited to come to a workshop on Black Lives Matter. And when I arrived at the workshop, for churches' response to Black Lives Matter. When I arrived, the majority of the persons present were African American clergy. And so I stood out in the room. And as we had the conversation about Black Lives Matter and how the church responds and supports that, there were statements made by some of the clergy which indicated perhaps not all Black lives mattered. And they suggested that same-gender loving Black lives didn't matter. Gender non-conforming Black lives didn't matter. And I expressed that I was a same-gender loving person, and I couldn't understand how they could throw a portion of their lives under the bus as not being worthy of their recognition that their lives mattered. The struggle I have in listening to what you're saying and trying to understand how I respond to that is, I certainly came there and could not avoid being there from a position of white male privilege. And so I was part of the oppression, but yet I was also trying to bring a voice of disruption to their notion that there were only certain people that they felt they could stand up and protect. And part of my challenge to them was that these are their children, and if they can sacrifice them, how can they object to a society that also is willing to decide there are certain people not of worth?
Well, so I say this on the basis of several reports that I had to make while I pastored here in Chicago. I appreciate your being in that space, and I appreciate your integrity with wrestling with how you felt as a minority, which is a strange, I'm assuming, a strange feeling. And I appreciate your vulnerability in sharing that with us. My district superintendent would often ask me what, I was doing with my church to deal with diversity, and I would often say, I struggle with, our church, we have yet to have white people come in on a regular basis. So, but I understand what it's like to be uncomfortable as a Black person in society. So the first part of that question and your ability to speak and attend to what was clearly an issue of oppression and what I think of as intra-communal oppression. So we wrestle with that. But on the other hand, what I'm constantly saying to my LGBTQ friends is that we have a serious work to do within the LGBTQ community on matters of racism. So it's not to suggest that simply the Black community is wrestling with all Black Lives Matter, but that the LGBTQ community is wrestling with any Black Lives Matter. So that is the greater work that you, my friend, have to do for us. And I know you are working with that and working on it. I assume it by your question. Thank you.
I want to say thank you for allowing us to have questions to what you talked about. Thank you for letting us. Oh, yeah. Thank you for allowing this question session. So, was listening to you talk about autonomy in relationship to human being. Well, my interpretation of autonomy is we have as I have autonomy, but I still want to be sociable with other human beings. And then the last thing about the work of activism is not to join acceptance with the status quo. Okay, so how do one adjust, let's say in a society where people are very sociable, still maintain autonomy and continually, I'm interpreting this to challenge status quo, but be different than status quo, so to speak. And then if we're trying to be more in this environment as sociable beings in the status quo, that's an issue that we have to disrupt. Is there ever a point where we all just are one community where the status quo and the other LGBT and let's say Black people and then even mental health people, which is in all colors or whatever, how do we all then get around the bonfire of life and live?
Yeah. Well,
I'm sorry for such a loaded question.
No, I feel the spirit of your question and the gentleness of your question. Your question is really asking us. People laughed at Rodney King when he said, "Can't we just all get along?" But I think that's the heart of many questions about activism and status quo. See, what persons, and I'm thinking about power relationships here. And I've done a lot of reading with Michel Foucault, and that informs how I think about our relationships with one another and the power and how power is involved in this. And so what the activist is attempting to do is to create a world where those who are the power elite and or maybe even as Marx would say, it's a ruling body. What the activist is trying to do is move us towards the eradication of a status quo or stratification of persons, so that you're thinking about, so that there is a group of persons who understand themselves as being at a particular tier and everyone else is subordinate to that tier. And so what the activist is doing is actually trying to agitate and trying to move so that we get to that point that you want. But, the point that you speak about and the point that I'm speaking about cannot take place unless people are really willing to take some risk with their own privilege, you see. And it is our own particular autonomy, our sense of individualism that tempts us and that causes us to resist risking our privilege and setting our privilege aside for the greater work of reaching that eschatological vision that I have in mind, or what King would call as the beloved kingdom. But that's courageous. I mean, and it is a courageous and risque work even for me, because there are some things that I have privilege. Some of the privileges, in terms of my context, I don't really want to let go of if I tell the truth about it. And so I struggle with that all the time. So while you and I are, so for instance, and I'm not trying to, I don't want to give too long a question. While you and I both may be black, we have different, there's a different set of privileges that we may have. And I fight against that. When I go home to South Florida, I fight against my sense of privilege when it comes to my education. I listen to my sisters, and sometimes I'm like, she don't know what she's talking about. And I try to be honest with myself. And so I push myself to try to hear the heart of what my sisters are saying, because I love them. And I believe that even with broken English, that there is a brilliance to what they are saying. But that takes being in tune with who you are in contrast to humanity. But if you think of yourself in terms of a silo, okay, you the be-all and end-all of everything. You hot. But the truth of the matter is we all have our own levels of ignorance. And that's a courageous point to be. And that's where I push my LGBTQ white brothers and sisters. Y'all, I say, hey, y'all got some stuff now. And let's be honest about it. But on the other hand, I'm not willing to damn any group, to say that any group is just going to hell on the basis of a particular category, these constructs in life. I'm not willing to do that.
One more question.
Thank you, Dr. Lightsey, for your lecture and all of your womanist ways that you definitely present and share with us. I am so intrigued by what you shared today, particularly because of my own interest in the body and protests. And part of what I'm interested in kind of asking, but just as a little backdrop to it, in my own work, part of my claims have been that from the civil rights movement after Selma and the kind of decline of actual body action in protests also signaled the decline of the movement itself. And while the civil rights movement particularly kind of necessitated a politics of representation with bodies in protest, with a dressing up of suited and booted, but also walking in steel toes 50 plus miles, right? And necessitated a certain kind of protest, right? The Black Lives Matter movement has necessitated a different kind of protest with body blocking highways and ceremonial die-ins. But my question, in light of disruption, will bodies on the line, will that be the requirement for disruption to continue? Will it always, as you mentioned, not be Photoshop bodies, but be bodies on the line? Will that be always the marker of disruption, if you will?
I don't know. We live in technology, and I think there is this temptation that we can tweet our way through. But I really don't think genuine protest is distance education. I think you really need boots on the ground for it. That's my first inclination. I can't imagine. I just can't imagine it happening without bodies in motion there, because it's back to relationality. We get it when we see another human body agitating in a way that, a letter, please be nice to me, in a way that, and I'm I'm exaggerating here, but in a way that doesn't quite get it. I think we actually need military person, so I use that term, boots on the ground. But I'm also concerned, you bring up the 60s, I'm also concerned, as I try to stress, that we are losing leading voices. I'm not necessarily saying leaders. I'm concerned that we're losing leading voices on the front lines of this current, of the movement. And in ways that we lost leading voices on the front lines during the 60s, this is kind of repeating itself, because the truth of the matter is people do need to eat. We go back to working. But being able to do, so this is a privilege. So from my privileged position as a scholar, as a clergy person, and as I'm aging. So there are additional risks that I take because I'm at this stage in my life that I don't expect younger people to do. So I will, I'm like, hey, I'm gone. I'm out of here. I'm going to be there with my peoples, or if I lose my job for the stance that I'm taking against the church, well, hey, I've been poll before. I know how to adapt. I've learned that lesson, and I'm not going to be quiet. I'm not going to be quiet because I fear losing money. You understand what I'm saying? But what took place during the 60s is that people were watching, and eventually you saw major black leaders become politicians. You saw them. You see us move, and it takes a certain activist to be able to negotiate and work in the numbers of ways, like Reverend Blackman. I mean, she's here. She is a wonderful example of someone who's been able to stay on the front lines and yet be in multiple places. Now, I haven't talked to her, but I would believe that there are people who come at her all the time, with these, opportunities. But it takes a certain courage, it takes a certain person to stay steadfast on what is necessary for the moment. And that's what I don't want us to lose. And in addition to that, I don't want us to lose the capacity and the ability to maintain and to lock arms, and to be in step with persons outside of our particular communities that are doing the activism. So I'm saying LGBTQ persons cannot afford to operate in the LGBT rights movement without recognizing that black folk are there, that Latino persons are there, that Asian persons are there, that disabled persons are there, and that there's a multiplicity of persons that need to be highlighted other than always advertising white gay faces. We need to shake things up there.
We've gathered here to lift the memory of one who could have easily been forgotten. Let us hold Gilberto Castañeda's memory in our hearts as we leave this sacred space. Let us hold the memories and lives of queer people who've been forgotten in our hearts. Give us the strength and wisdom of Creator, we pray, to remember with words and deeds the queer bodies and souls that queerphobia has dismembered. I send with you, O fabulous creations, the Creator's abundant peace and love.